Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday edition of the Hockey Debates podcast. As always, I'm joined by my fellow hockey debater, Kevin Allen, the Hall of Fame hockey writer. And today we're delighted to be joined by Gillian Kemmerer, who's going to give us a whole different perspective on hockey right now. She's an expert on the KHL. She works for Sports Express. She hosts the Faceoff for the KHL. And Gillian, I understand tomorrow, or I guess basically an hour, because it'll be tomorrow in Russia in about an hour, is a huge day for signings in the KHL. So it seems like on the surface they're operating as business as usual.
Yeah, tomorrow's a big day. So we're actually really starting an hour from now. And there's a Twitter account called the Kaprizov Countdown that's absolutely losing itself at the moment. So obviously contracts are expiring today. As of May 1st, the KHL players are fair game. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens. And we're already starting to see a little bit of movement. The young goaltender, Alexei Melnichuk, just signed in the NHL with the Sharks. He's a very interesting undrafted goalie, 21, but I think some big announcements are coming tomorrow.
Gillian, I'm glad to have you on because I've wondered about a long time about to get a insider's perspective on how the KHL is doing. Like from the outside looking in, we've seen it. The franchises that many of the top franchises are still the top franchises, but are they doing well financially? What's the level of interest in the league from the Russian population? How would you describe where the KHL is at right now?
The KHL over the course of the past few seasons has really tightened up, and a big influence in that decision has been financial. So clubs are expected to be able to make it on their own, and the clubs that have financial difficulties, even storied clubs from the Soviet League and before, they are bounced out of the KHL kind of like, as if it was promotion relegation. So you do see teams leaving the KHL, which makes competitive parity better, which makes the overall financial health of the league better. And one thing that I always think about, and that I even brought up with the former president of the KHL, Chernyshenko, was, are you worried about the sensitivity of this league to oil prices? Because so many teams are sponsored by oil and gas. And one of the things that they've done at the league level certainly is to diversify their sponsors. We see SAP getting involved, providing more advanced marketing metrics. And as far as support goes, the KHL is immensely well supported. The teams in Moscow have gorgeous brand new stadiums. If you look at the team even out in Novosibirsk, Sibir, it's out in Siberia. They have an absolutely rabid fan base. So you see the products getting better. You see the competitiveness getting better. And that's something that I think is obvious, not just to onlookers, but also to guys like Bob Hartley, who's only been in the league 2 seasons and says, I think every game is getting harder. So I think overall the KHL is doing pretty well.
You talk about the big signing day tomorrow. I mean, obviously with the uncertainty about the NHL, we don't know if they're going to play. They're talking about playing through the summer and maybe even having the playoffs go into September. I got to think any guy who's on an expiring contract, whether even if he's an AHL player, a lot of them are going to look at Europe. I know a good friend of mine, Michael Layton, played in the KHL for quite a while and told me he loved it over there. A lot of these guys would look at that as a serious option. I mean, if they play until September, that's off the table because, if KHL operates as normal, they're usually in camp sometime in mid-August. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And some are even as early as late July. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with those summer training camps. The KHL is projecting to come back September the 2nd, which is their normal date. But what these individual teams will decide about their training camps and where they'll host those training camps with 6 countries involved, it's going to be interesting to watch the next couple of weeks for sure. But I do suspect, first of all, we're seeing a lot of young Russians coming over to the NHL. So there's going to be openings for players. There's now a salary cap and ceiling imposed. So we'll see some interesting movements, I think, over the next couple of weeks. But with so much uncertainty in the NHL, I wouldn't be surprised to see movement. And we do have a couple of huge moves, such as Kaprizov and Sorokin, which I actually think may have been slightly delayed because these guys are wondering if the NHL comes back, is there any possibility I could play, ahead of the 2021 season? And the fact of the matter is the NHL right now says you can't negotiate for anything related to this season we're still in, but if they come back, will they relax it? So I think that's been some of the holdup with some of the bigger signings, but we should expect to see some pretty big announcements coming, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some imports moving over, especially as we see more import coaches in the league, the visibility is going up, all of that.
Gillian, there's a lot of interest in the NHL and the young Russian goalie Yaroslav Askarov. What do you think? What does he want to do? Does he want to come over in the NHL as quickly as possible, or do you have any knowledge on what he would like to do in terms of his NHL aspirations?
I believe that he's currently signed through 22, and given that he's 17 years old, I like that personally. I think a lot of the great Russian young goaltenders tend to come over more in the neighborhood of 23, 24, like Shesterkin, Sorokin. I definitely think that an NHL career is on the table, and Igor Larionov was on the bench for that Russian World Juniors team this past year, and he was telling Scotty Bowman that even though we saw Askarov moving around, that he is in fact a good goaltender. And when you look at his statistics in the VHL, they might look like a league average goaltender, but he's 17 years old playing against men, and there's just glimmers of talent there, especially with the fact that he is one of those kind of rare right glove goalies. He seems to read passes and shooters very well. So I think there's rightfully a lot of excitement about him. I would hope to see him stay in the K for a couple of seasons. And one of the big reasons why is that you have to think not just about the prospect, but the organization he's in, because in the KHL, there are differences between the organizations. SKA St. Petersburg is where Igor Shesterkin came from. They play on North American sized ice at home. Now, the KHL is normalizing ice sizes. They're going to go to 2, like a hybrid between Olympic and North American and North American. But for a goalie, it's nice to see him on North American sized ice at home. Very North American minded organization that's produced a lot of prospects. And SKA St. Petersburg is consistently a contender. So if he steps in, and Melnichuk's now out, he's coming to the NHL. If he steps into a backup role or otherwise, he may even get a deep playoff run under his belt. So all of that looks good to me for Askarov.
You just recently, I saw on your Twitter feed, you talked with Alexei Yashin, obviously well known in North America for his time with the Senators and the Islanders, but also known for how much work he did with the Russian women's Olympic team at the Sochi Games. That's the biggest issue, I think, with women's hockey right now, is they need other countries to develop stronger squads. So Canada and the U.S. have challengers. How has Russian women's hockey progressed since the Sochi Games? Are they still making it a priority?
They are. And in fact, the WHL, the professional league in Russia, I spent a lot of time with them. In fact, I was at their finals in March before coronavirus hit and I came home. And the WHL has been taken under the KHL's wing. They're financing it. They're providing best-in-class management ideas. They're even providing arenas in some cases. The UFA team plays in the smaller arena attached to Salavat Yulayev's KHL arena. So all of these are incredible signs of the level of investment that they're putting in women's hockey there. Some mega North American stars that are sitting out of the North American season, Alex Carpenter, who's an Olympic silver medalist, as well as Bobby Carpenter, the NHLer's daughter, Megan Bozek, Nora Ratu, one of the best goaltenders, men or women playing in the world right now. They're all playing in the WHL. So you see good talent level, you're seeing a commitment from a men's league. And I think that that's a really big deal, is having that men's league with the resources and with a lot of the managerial experience helping these clubs get started. Are they posting, absolutely unbelievable attendance numbers? Not yet. In China, actually, they're doing pretty well, and they've set quite a few attendance records. They have a Chinese club in the league. But they are doing a lot to improve women's hockey. And a lot of the Russian young women that are playing and are competitive in that league were under Alexei Yashin's wing when he was working with the team around Sochi, and they have just the utmost affinity and respect for him. It was obvious throughout the All-Star weekend because he participated there.
Gillian, I have a 2-part question for you. Over here, there's a lot of interest in Alex Ovechkin's possibility of breaking Wayne Gretzky's record for goals in a career. And that looked to be an unbreakable record. And now Ovi has been so consistent in the last decade that he now has a shot at it, a legitimate shot. So number one, are folks in Russia paying any attention to that at all? And number two, there seems to be kind of an undercurrent here that when Ovi's done in the NHL, he'll go back and play a season and two in the KHL, much like Datsuk did. And as a person who witnessed his popularity in Russia when I covered the Sochi games, I could see that happening. But I wanted to get your take on both of those.
So Alexander Ovechkin is very well followed in Russia. If you're walking around Moscow and you're seeing NHL gear, you're seeing a lot of Washington Capitals gear. And obviously, he's not the only Russian there, but he is a big, big factor. And he's very well loved and well known for his support of the national team. He's very interconnected with the Russian government. He's quite close and in the sort of circle of President Vladimir Putin. There is a lot of focus on him. And if he were to break that scoring record, it would be a big feather in the Russians' caps. Obviously, there's still always a little bit of that North America versus Russia thing. So that would be huge. And he and the NHL is well followed. In fact, the NHL signed an amazing deal with Yandex, which is sort of like the Russian Google and Uber and everything combined. And they're streaming games for free. So there's a very nice increase in visibility of the NHL right now there. So yes, Ovi's a big deal no matter where you are in the world. If he goes back to play for the KHL, I could see it. Alexei Yashin did, as we were just talking about him. Pavel Datsyuk went back to his home club, as you mentioned, Yekaterinburg. I see it in a million years, and I think that he's going to come back and probably draw enormous crowds no matter where he goes. So I suppose that he might look at that either as a nod to his Russian fans or just, a way to close out an unbelievable career. And he may even try to go for a Gagarin Cup, who knows? But I suspect that he will absolutely come back. And if he does, he's going to be lauded as a god for sure.
Gillian, you mentioned the women's team in China. Is it this year that the expansion team's coming in from Beijing? I know you've done a lot of work on that team. Two people who are well known in this side of the hockey world, Kurt Fraser and Alexei Kovalev, are the people kind of behind that team. Am I right? Is it this year they're coming in? And what's kind of been the response? I know in Harbin, in that part of China, there's a real hockey hotbed, but I don't know, is people in Beijing excited about hockey?
So the team's been operating for actually a couple seasons in the KHL. It's the women's team that was a new addition to Russia, but the men's team has a few seasons under its belt. Kurt Fraser is at the helm. Alexei Kovalev is his assistant coach. Chris Chelios' son Jake is playing there. I mean, you have Devontae Smith-Pelly, the Stanley Cup winner with the Caps. So it's been a very interesting season for them. They didn't qualify for the playoffs. And in fact, the only season that they qualified was their first season. So they've had some performance issues. But, when you think about the fact that, one, they couldn't go home for the entirety of the last crack of their season because of the coronavirus, they're basically floating from place to place untethered. That was really, really tough for the organization. And they've been in a building phase. As far as crowds go, they've switched homes now 3 times. So they were in Shanghai for a bit because Beijing, they were still trying to prepare an arena. Then they went home to Beijing for a couple of games when they opened up one of the Olympic practice venues. And then this season I was with them when they opened in Shenzhen, which is basically right on the border with Hong Kong. And it's been a really tough opportunity for them to attract crowds in Beijing. But I think that in Beijing, at least, they've done better because, one, they have a bit more marketing. They are Kunlun Red Star Beijing. And 2, that arena's kind of small. It actually, I think, doesn't even meet the basic KHL capacity regulation, but that was allowed for this kind of jump up to their next arena, which they're going to have to change arenas because they have to come down to either North American or Finnish size ice. They're playing on Olympic right now. Better crowds, I think it's only going to continue to get better. If the team performs better, it's going to generate more interest as well. The women's team's very good, and they actually attract quite a nice crowd on the back of that success.
Gillian, just one final question before we let you go. What's the future of the KHL? Like, do you see them? Is what we see what we get, or do you think there'll be an expansion, into other parts of Europe at some point, or maybe even condensing the number of teams they have?
President Chernyshenko, who has now been appointed into the government, but he was the president up until very, very recently, met with a small group of journalists. I was there, and he was asked about this. And he said, first of all, the KHL is interested in expanding further into Europe. And, they've toyed with a couple of ideas. London was one that was on the table. Politics sort of prevented that from happening, but there are still other cities in Europe that they're considering. But right now, a big priority is a second team in China and maybe even the development of an Asian division of the KHL. Russia politically is turning eastward. I wouldn't be surprised to see the KHL do the same. So I think there's big possibilities for more global expansion. But they are right now focused on clamping down financially, getting the salary cap and floor in place, after we see some of that, and maybe we see some recovery related to COVID-19, I suspect you'll continue to see international expansion from the KHL. That's always been their growth strategy.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us today, Gillian, and informing us on a part of the hockey world that is fascinating, I think, for both of us. But we don't get a lot of KHL news in North America, so it's always interesting to hear about it. And again, thanks for joining us, and we really appreciate it. And have a great day.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Gillian.
All right. See you soon. Oh, well, that is, I think, an interesting point, Kevin, is if they do start this NHL season up again and it goes into August or September or whatever, what about those guys with expiring contracts who don't get a North American offer? They're kind of going to be left out in the cold because Europe will be already playing if they go on schedule.
Yeah, no, that was really a fascinating interview with Gillian. I took a lot from that interview. Like, we know politically from what we've seen that Russia and China have started to work together on the world stage. And boy, it does make perfect sense, as she said, that they would do that in hockey as well. And we know that China has tried to beef up its hockey program. The NHL has had a presence over there for a while in terms of trying to do their part, try to grow the game, because that's really an untapped market for the NHL in terms of merchandise sales. I mean, you look at the impact that that market had on the NBA jersey sales, and you can see why they'd want to go over that. But I think at the old adage, I remember that when Russian leader, I don't remember who it was, but said something about that. Mao said that Russia and China would be enemies for 10,000 years, and the Russian leader said, no, you're wrong on that. And Mao said, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it'll be 9,999 years. Well, that's completely different now, because you see all sorts of stories of them, working together for development of oil systems in that area of the world, and where before it used to be the U.S. that would be trying to work with China or whomever. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Wouldn't it be funny if we ended up seeing a KHL that had 3 or 4 or 5 teams in China and maybe a team in Japan, and that would really be fascinating to be sure.
Well, I know from other sports like rugby and soccer, for example, a lot of, especially in Japan, and you see it now some in China, where it's very similar to the KHL, where these big corporations are sponsoring teams and just throwing money at. I know in rugby they've paid some of the best players in the world to come over and play in Japan toward the end of their career, and if you get the kind of money that is around in some of these bigger companies in China and Japan involved, they could lure some pretty big names, you would think, to the KHL.
That's for sure. That would be. There's a lot of money in that region, and more importantly, a lot of resources. And if they ever could get, like those are 2 big economic superpowers that if you got them together, just think of the strength of that. And it would be interesting to see. The one thing that has happened since the arrival of the KHL that has surprised me a little bit is I thought for the most part top players would still want to come to the NHL, but and that is true. I mean, the really elite players, but if you look at the number of Russians that are in the NHL, it's down from where it should be. Like, there should be more of them, in my opinion. And the numbers, I remember last year, maybe it was the year before, I looked and there was only like 27, Russians. I don't know how many there were this season, but it's less than I think there should be. And I think what has surprised me is, elite level players will come over and play here because this is the best players in the world. But if you're just below that level, you say to yourself, I like the shorter schedule. I want to play in front of my family and friends. The money over here is pretty good. The money in the KHL, they pay more than any other European league. So, there are a lot of reasons to stay there, and Russians just tend to want to stay and play that. And that's completely understandable, to be honest with you, because you come over here and you've got to learn a new language and so forth. But That still surprised me. I thought we would end up with a lot more Russian players, but the KHL has managed to keep not the real elite players. They're still over here, but the next level, they've stayed in the KHL, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think if you're a journeyman player and you're away from home, I mean, you see it more so now too, even with some of the Swedes and the Finns. Like they'll give it one shot over here. They'll sign one contract, and if they're not NHL regulars by the end of that contract, a lot of them are going home because I guess they figure they can play at home. I mean, they're probably, if you're in the AHL, certainly you're probably making around the same money, if not a little better, playing in your home country. And you look at the lifestyle; it's what they're used to. I mean, do you really want to come over to a foreign country and be a guy who plays on the third or fourth line, or becomes a journeyman who plays for 5 or 6 teams, or even worse, is a bubble guy who's up and down, up and down, up and down, and you can go home and play for the big team?
Yeah, no, that's right. And there's Russia is a hockey country. I think other than soccer. Soccer's probably number 1, I would guess, and I would say hockey's number 2. So there's if you're into the the glamour and the celebrity status, you can have that. The money's pretty good, and you don't have to come over here and change your lifestyle and learn a new language and a new culture and and everything else. And right or wrong, it seems like the Russians players have had, not all, but have had more trouble adjusting than some of the other European players. And obviously that's, it often just depends on the personalities, but, that would be my observation that, they come over here and they probably have a little bit more difficult time because, and my guess is because, if you're Swedish or Finnish, you're likely to have already been introduced to English through the school system, and it doesn't appear that in Russia they have that advantage. I mean, I don't know that for sure, but having interviewed so many Russian players, I'd say that seems evident that they had not been introduced before they came over. Most of them have had to learn English through watching U.S. television programs. That's how they tend to learn the language.
Back on this side of the world, there's been a lot of speculation lately about the NHL draft going ahead in June, as it normally would. And there seems to be a groundswell of support for that. Although yesterday, Steve Yzerman was on Fox Sports in Detroit and said that he thought it was a foolish idea, basically. Like, the season isn't over, and we still don't know if there's going to be a season or not. So how do you have a draft when the regular season isn't finished and the league is saying their objective is to finish it? I mean, I think he's got a valid point. Like, how do you rank the teams? I mean, traditionally the Stanley Cup champion picks last. Well, how are we going to rank who picks where when we haven't completed the season?
Well, I've been opposed to it right from the first time I've heard it, and I think while there is some support for it, I don't think it's widespread. I think there are as many people around the league that are against this as for it. And my issue centers on, I don't like, changing the rules. Like, there's been suggesting that if we do this, we might have to adjust how the lottery works. And, maybe go back to the old system where you can only move up 4 spots. I just don't like that. I don't like starting out. There's no reason why we have to move the draft other than, and I think, I understand why especially the league officials want to move it. We've seen the success of the NFL draft, even though I think the NHL draft's a little bit different because, there are casual people who watch that NFL draft because they have allegiances to specific colleges. And, you can, even if you're just a casual college football fan, you're going to know some of these people in America aren't going to know many of the people who are going to be drafted in the NHL draft. But saying all that, I think the league wants to get the NHL back in the news. There's no traffic to the NHL websites, and that's true of every other sport as well. But I think we're a gate revenue driven league, and we're going to have to come back and play to empty arenas. And so they want to, create a little buzz. And, I think they wanted, the ideas is they'll work real hard and they'll at least give each time some player is drafted, we'll probably tell his story and make him seem as interesting as possible. And I get all that. It's a marketing thing. I understand all that. But in order to do that, like you said, we'd have to take an unfinished season and sort of extrapolate how we think that this was going to unfold. And then we're going to go play. And, how silly will it look if, somebody that ends up winning the lottery and then squeezes into the playoffs, because they came in. What if the New York Rangers won the lottery and then somehow got into the playoffs when we start to resume again? So I don't know. It just seems that it's too big a reach. I don't like changing the rules. I'm a bit of a traditionalist. If we start the season with the rules, we should keep those until the off season if we want to change them.
I just think it would be foolish looking to have, like, let's say the Red Wings got Alexis Lafreniere, and then they start playing again and they're finishing out their season, and there he is sitting in the press box watching the Red Wings play, but he's not allowed to play yet. I mean, that would just be
it
would just look silly.
Yeah, no, it's just, I mean, like I said, I mean, it's all good intentions that started this drive to have the draft on June 6th. I mean, it's based on the fact that, they just want to give fans something. But, sometimes good intentions can kind of go astray. And that's what this feels like to me. Like, look, it's not going to be the end of the world if we have the draft. We'll all get over it. But I don't know why we need to do that. And someone said, well, it'd be too big of a rush if we have to, if we complete the season in November and then complete the 2019-20 season in November, and then we start 2020 and 21 on December 2nd or 3rd. And I said, well, that's the way we normally do it anyway. You finish up the Stanley Cup, you run to Vegas to do the awards. You finish it up on a Monday night, you go to Vegas on Wednesday, and then you're at the draft on Thursday afternoon. That's the way we've been doing it for a while. So it's I think we can all handle it if we have to, push it a little bit after the end of the regular season.
So I know from conversations we had before we went on there, you've been talking to some the movers and shakers in the NHL, and what's your sense after talking to a few people that are going to be involved in the decision-making process?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that everybody is moving ahead as if we're going to resume the season. And I think people expect we're going to do that. And every effort is being made to make sure that this has been going to be done in a credible, safe manner. I mean, I think they're going to, it's all sort of leaked out. They want to create sort of a biosphere safe zone experience for players, and and then have in NHL cities multiple games a day probably to get the teams playing. You'll be if we're in 4 or 6 cities, teams will go there and you'll play a couple of games and or 3 games and so forth, and we'll get this thing underway. Although the concerns I have, and I wrote a story about this today, is and it's just too early for them to have paid attention to this, but I know it's on their radar. When we think of the coming back, that we talk about the safety to the players, and then we also talk about what if they being the players contract the virus and then somehow pass it along to their parents who are older, and we know that this is young, healthy people do well with this virus in terms of the mortality rate. And NHL players, by definition, are young, healthy people. But the older generation is the group that's struggling, and we forget that we have plenty of those in the NHL. They're general managers and they're coaches, they're assistant coaches, they're broadcasters. And so I posed the question to people around the league, and everybody said, yeah, we're going to get to that, and I believe them. I think that they're going to get to that. But Bill Daly said that right now they haven't considered any restrictions. They haven't thought to say, hey, we recommend that anyone over 60 not be part of the process, to watch it from home. They haven't considered that yet. but he did say that he would expect once we get closer, if we indeed are going to be able to do it, if the environment allows us to do it, that they would be vetting through medical experts what should be done. And it's, which leads me, and NBC, by the way, gave me pretty much a similar response. I mean, they have Mike Emmerich, who's in his 70s. They have Mike Milbury, who's 67. Eddie Olczyk and Pierre McGuire are both cancer survivors who I would assume have a greater risk as well. And NBC said that, when we get closer, we're going to address all this, because, what I ask is would they consider calling the games from outside the arena, from from a studio, like sometimes we used to see with the World Juniors or World Championships and so forth. So, and they said they would address it. So I think people are concerned about it, because, Bob, that Jim Rutherford and David Poyle and Dale Talon, who's going to be 70, and Rick Bowness is going to, they're all going to want to participate, regardless of their age. And we know too that, if you're in good health, even at that age, it mitigates your age risk factor. So I think they're going to try to do that, but it remains to be seen what the league and other folks, maybe they'll step in and try to save these people from themselves, saying, hey, look, it's just prudent and reasonable if if you don't come in and just, do your thing from the safety of, your home, at least for the foreseeable future.
Well, we certainly don't want to see any of them run out of time before it's their time. And unfortunately, we've run out of time again. So we're going to bid adieu on that note. I'm Bob Duff. He's Kevin Allen. We're Hockey Debaters on the hockeydebates.com podcast. And we'll be back with you on Monday. And thanks to everyone for joining us today.